The voice that made 750 million people rise to their feet during the 1991 Super Bowl performance of the Star-Spangled Banner couldn't hit a single clean note on that Manchester stage in 2009. Whitney Houston's vocal perfection had become legendary. Her 5-octave range, whistle register, and emotional depth. But listening to the recordings from that night, you're witnessing one of music history's most tragic collapses. Those iconic high notes from "I Will Always Love You" were now just memories. The whispered instruction, "Turn on the playback," to Whitney crying backstage, marked the moment the voice was buried in silence. So who or what had stolen Whitney's voice? Before I tell you this story, if you're curious about music history's deepest secrets, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because Whitney's night was so much more than just a concert disaster. February 2009. Manchester AO Arena. On that cold February night in Manchester, Whitney Houston stood in front of the mirror in the AO Arena's backstage area. Makeup artist Elena Vasquez's hands were trembling, because Whitney's face was no longer the face of that powerful woman she once knew. The dark circles under her eyes were being covered with heavy makeup, but the exhaustion in Whitney's soul couldn't be hidden. Elena would describe that moment in an interview years later. Whitney was looking for herself in that mirror. She parted her lips, tried to make a sound, but what came out was just a raspy breath. Whitney's vocal coach Gary Katona was in full panic mode backstage. During the final rehearsals, Whitney's voice had completely given out, and now there were only 30 minutes left before she had to take the stage. Katona's phone calls were frantic. "We need to cancel the concert." "No, Whitney won't agree." "Yes, I know how much money we'll lose." But what no one knew at the time was that these phone conversations were being recorded by a sound technician named Kim Freeman. When Freeman shared these recordings with the press years later, the full extent of Whitney's management's panic that night would be revealed. Final preparations backstage. With 15 minutes to go before the concert, Whitney's former producer David Foster unexpectedly appeared backstage. Foster was the arranger of Whitney's biggest hit, "I Will Always Love You," and seeing Whitney in this condition shook him deeply. When Whitney saw Foster, her eyes welled up, and she hugged him. Foster would never forget that moment. "When I hugged Whitney, I could feel her bones. That strong, resilient woman was no longer there." Foster suggested Whitney cancel the concert, but Whitney's response was clear. "David, if they love me, they'll accept me like this too." During this conversation, Whitney's security chief Marcus Thompson was trying to keep reporters away from the backstage area. A photographer from The Sun had tried to secretly photograph Whitney's condition, and Thompson's intervention prevented those photos from ever being published. Thompson would later recount this incident. "I did everything I could to protect Whitney's dignity." When it was time to take the stage, Whitney stood in front of the mirror one last time. Turning to makeup artist Elena, she said, "I feel like I'm taking the stage for the last time today." These words pierced Elena's heart because she could sense Whitney's intuition. As Whitney put on her black stage dress, her hands were shaking. Costume designer Patricia Field had to make last-minute adjustments to the dress to fit Whitney's weakened frame. The moment of truth. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the lights at Manchester AO Arena went down, and the crowd of 15,000 went wild. After the announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, Whitney Houston." When the stage lights illuminated Whitney, whispers began to rise among the audience. Whitney's physical appearance had shocked her fans. There was a dramatic difference between the glorious Whitney of the 1990s and the woman standing before them. When Whitney took the microphone in her hand, her first words were supposed to be, "Hello Manchester, I love you." But her voice was so hoarse that the audience in the back rows couldn't hear these words. From backstage, Gary Katona signaled to the sound technician on stage to turn up the microphone volume. Whitney noticed this and tried to laugh it off, saying, "I guess I need to warm up my voice a little." The first song was going to be "I Wanna Dance with Somebody." This was one of Whitney's most energetic and beloved songs. But when the first notes came out, the arena fell silent. Whitney's voice was trembling, and those famous high notes were no longer there. When the chorus arrived, Whitney's voice completely cut out, and she took a few steps toward backstage to collect herself. The audience's first reaction, Sarah Mitchell, sitting in the front rows of AO Arena, will never forget that night. When Whitney came on stage, we were all so excited. But when the first song started, I saw the expressions on the faces of people around me change. There was a mixture of worry, sadness, and disappointment on everyone's face. The amateur video recordings Mitchell captured that night would become some of the most valuable documents of that evening. When Whitney moved to the second song, How Will I Know, the situation got even worse. She couldn't sing that iconic opening melody, and playback kicked in from backstage. When Whitney realized this, a look of shame appeared on her face, and she told the audience, "I'm a little hoarse today, thank you for your understanding." But the arena was silent. That atmosphere was too heavy for the audience, because this wasn't the performance they expected from Whitney Houston. At this point, panic was growing backstage. Concert manager Phil Roberts had activated the emergency plan. Roberts and his team were considering cutting the concert short and getting Whitney off stage. But Whitney would absolutely not allow it. Roberts describes that moment. "I approached Whitney and suggested we postpone the concert, but she looked at me in such a way that I saw all her determination in that look. She said, 'I'm Whitney Houston, and I'm going to finish this show.'" The emotional breakdown begins. When the third song, I Have Nothing, came on, Whitney could no longer hold back her tears. The lyrics of this song, "I have nothing, nothing, nothing. If I don't have you," showed a terrifying parallel with Whitney's current situation. During the most emotional part of the song, Whitney's voice completely cut out and she lowered her microphone. The stage lights illuminated the tears streaming down Whitney's cheeks. It was right at this moment that one of the most touching moments in music history occurred. An audience member in the middle of the arena stood up and began singing the words, "I have nothing if I don't have you." This person was 52-year-old teacher Robert Thompson, who had been a Whitney fan since the 1980s. Thompson's voice spread everywhere, thanks to the arena's acoustics. Within seconds, people from the front rows joined Thompson, then the middle section, then the upper tiers. All 15,000 people in the AO Arena were standing and singing Whitney's song. Whitney stood on stage watching this scene, and her tears were now flowing like a river. But this time they were tears of joy. The most emotional moment, when the audience finished the song, the arena applauded for a long time. Whitney took the microphone in her hand and said with her trembling voice, "I love you so much, Manchester. This was the most beautiful gift." After these words, the arena burst into applause again, and Whitney showed her first real smile of the night. But the concert had to continue, and Whitney's biggest hit, "I Will Always Love You," hadn't been sung yet. This song was the pinnacle of Whitney's career, and at the same time her most challenging song. Whitney knew she could no longer hit those famous high notes. The "I Will Always Love You" crisis. When the song's intro began, the arena fell silent. Everyone was wondering what Whitney would do. Whitney took the microphone in her hand and began singing the first lyrics of the song. The first verse was relatively good, but as the chorus approached, Whitney's anxiety increased. When it came to that famous "And I Will Always Love You" part, Whitney's voice cut out again. This time playback kicked in from backstage, but Whitney refused to accept it. She raised her hand to stop the playback and turned to the audience. "This song should be sung together with you," she said, and extended the microphone toward the audience. All 15,000 people began singing that iconic melody in unison. Whitney walked around the stage, trying to make eye contact with audience members in every corner. Final words backstage. When the concert ended and Whitney returned backstage, she had collapsed. She was completely exhausted, physically and emotionally. When Gary Katona approached her, Whitney's first words were, "Tell the sound engineer that tonight it wasn't Whitney Houston on stage, just Whitney." These words were the summary of that night. The Whitney Houston brand no longer existed, only a music-loving woman remained. While makeup artist Elena was removing Whitney's makeup, Whitney told her, "Elena, you know, tonight, I feel like I took the stage for the last time." Elena says she could never forget these words even years later. There was a peace in Whitney's eyes. It was like she had lifted a great burden from her shoulders. David Foster also said goodbye to Whitney that night. According to Foster's memories, Whitney told him, "David, thank you. You made me the voices. But tonight I learned that I can continue to be Whitney." When Foster heard these words, he thought Whitney understood her inner journey. Post-concert reactions. The next day, British media evaluated the concert. The Guardian newspaper ran with the headline, "Whitney Houston's tragic farewell performance," while the Times used the headline, "The collapse of a legend." But on social media, audience members were writing different things. Sarah Mitchell wrote in her Facebook post, "Last night I wasn't at a Whitney Houston concert. I was at a woman's courage show." Robert Thompson, the person who started singing the song, said this in a radio interview the day after the concert. "Whitney's condition at that moment really affected me. I felt I needed to support her in that moment. Music is our common language, and that night we spoke that language." Whitney's personal transformation. After this concert, Whitney Houston's inner circle noticed she had changed. Pat Houston, Whitney's sister-in-law and manager, observed that Whitney was calmer and more peaceful during that period. Whitney had finally accepted that her voice wasn't what it used to be, and this acceptance brought her a different kind of freedom. Whitney's personal assistant Monique MacDonald said during that period, "Whitney was playing piano more and writing song lyrics. Whitney was no longer under performance pressure, and her relationship with music had become more intimate." According to MacDonald, Whitney would say, "I don't have to be perfect anymore. I just need to be real." Long-term effects. The Manchester concert became a turning point in Whitney Houston's career. After this concert, Whitney stopped performing in large arenas and focused on performing in smaller, more intimate venues. Her final album, I Look to You, released in 2010, was a reflection of this change. Whitney's voice on the album wasn't as powerful as before, but its emotional depth was greater. Music critic Anthony DeCurtis interpreted this change as follows. "Whitney Houston lost her voice in Manchester but found her soul. What happened on stage that night wasn't a technical failure, it was a human triumph." Secret recordings and archive materials. The biggest mystery that emerged after the Manchester concert was where the complete recordings of that night were. The concert was officially recorded and was planned to be released as a DVD, but this never happened. Sound technician Kim Freeman's backstage recordings were just the tip of the iceberg. Freeman claimed there was much more to what Whitney said backstage. According to Freeman's 2015 interview, Whitney remained in the backstage area for about 40 minutes after the concert and had deep conversations with various people during this time. Freeman had recorded important parts of these conversations because he felt that what Whitney said that night was of historical importance. These recordings also included Whitney's phone conversation with her daughter Bobby Christina. When Whitney answered the phone, she told Bobby Christina, "Baby, Mommy learned something very important tonight. I don't have to be perfect. You should never try to be perfect either. Just be real." This phone conversation was also an indication of the change in Whitney's motherhood identity. Clive Davis's emergency intervention. 2 days after the concert, Whitney's longtime mentor Clive Davis flew to Manchester. Davis was 77 years old at the time, but didn't hesitate to make this journey for Whitney. Davis's meeting with Whitney took place at the Lowry Hotel, and details of this meeting would appear in Davis's 2013 biography. According to Davis, Whitney had openly expressed for the first time that she was tired of her career during that meeting. Clive, "I've been trying to be perfect for 30 years. In Manchester I learned that people love me, not because I'm perfect, but because I'm real," Whitney had said. Davis writes that these words deeply affected him, and he understood that Whitney needed to open a new page in her career. During this meeting, Davis suggested to Whitney that voice technologies had advanced, and that tools like auto-tune could restore her voice to its former power. But Whitney rejected this suggestion. "No, Clive, I don't want to be fake anymore. If I'm going to sing, I'll sing with my own voice," she replied. Bobby Brown's unexpected reaction. Whitney's ex-husband Bobby Brown had watched the Manchester concert on television, and the footage deeply affected him. Brown was struggling with his own problems at the time, but seeing Whitney in that condition spurred him into action. What Brown wrote in his diary during those days contained surprising details when they came to light years later. Brown had written this in his diary: "I saw Whitney on television, crying backstage. That strong woman was no longer there, but someone more beautiful was in her place. The real Whitney. I wish I could have hugged her and said, 'Everything's okay.'" Brown would carry this regret until the day Whitney died. Brown also noted in his diary that he had sent Whitney a letter after the Manchester concert. The content of this letter was never revealed, but Whitney's close friend Cece Winans reported that Whitney cried after reading that letter and said, "Bobby finally understands me." Cissy Houston's reaction as a mother. Whitney's mother, Cissy Houston, hadn't watched the Manchester concert live, but when she watched the recordings, her daughter's condition devastated her. What Cissy wrote in her diary during that period starkly reflected a mother's pain. "When I saw my daughter on that stage, I saw everything I wanted to see in her as a child. Brave, sincere and real. But at the same time, she was fragile. The Whitney Houston brand had almost destroyed her, but the real Whitney was still there," Cissy had written. When Cissy visited Whitney a week after the concert, she noticed the change in her daughter's state of mind. Whitney was no longer constantly stressed and looked relaxed for the first time in many years. Cissy described this change as follows: "It was like she had lifted a great burden from her shoulders." Fans' long-term reactions. Most of the fans who attended the Manchester concert described that night as the most important musical experience of their lives. Thousands of posts were made on social media under the hashtag Manchester Miracle. Fans praised Whitney's courage that night and stated they loved her even more. Scottish fan Moira Campbell had spent £400 that night and had come specially from London to Manchester. Campbell's blog post after that night went viral. "I came to watch the Whitney Houston brand, but I met a woman named Whitney. And that woman was much more beautiful." American fan Julie Anderson described that night as follows: "When I saw Whitney crying backstage, I cried too. But that crying wasn't sadness, it was a kind of catharsis. Whitney was finally free." Sound technicians' professional analysis. When the sound technicians working at the Manchester concert professionally analyzed Whitney's vocal condition, they realized it wasn't just a physical problem. Whitney's vocal cords were damaged. But the real problem was psychological. The pressure of trying to be perfect for years had blocked Whitney's natural singing ability. Sound technician Mark Stevens's analysis was as follows: "Whitney's voice was still technically there, but she didn't have access to that voice. It was like she was afraid of her own voice. In Manchester, for the first time, she let go of that fear, and her voice began to return." This technical analysis was confirmed in Whitney's subsequent performances. In the small concerts she gave after Manchester, Whitney's voice had partially recovered because the pressure for perfection was gone. The music industry's reaction. The Manchester concert also resonated in the music industry. Many artists praised Whitney's courage and shared similar experiences. Mariah Carey said in an interview during that period, "What Whitney did in Manchester was what all of us were afraid to do: being real." Celine Dion sent Whitney a special letter, and a copy of this letter was found among Whitney's personal belongings. In the letter, Dion wrote, "You taught us not only how to sing, but also how to be real." Whitney's personal transformation. In the 2 years following the Manchester concert, Whitney Houston transformed into a completely different person. She no longer felt the obligation to constantly appear made up and perfect. Close friends observed that Whitney was laughing more and was more relaxed. Whitney's personal assistant Monique MacDonald said during that period, Whitney would sing while playing piano at home, and these moments were when she was happiest. Whitney was now making music without the pressure of the record company. During this period, Whitney began giving music workshops for young people. In these workshops, she taught young people the emotional dimension of music rather than technique. "Don't look for the perfect voice, look for the real voice," Whitney would say in these lessons. Change in her relationship with Bobby Christina. Whitney no longer felt guilty about not being able to spend time with her daughter because of her career, because the pressure of her career had diminished. Bobby Christina was 16 years old at the time, and closely observed Whitney's change. According to records in Bobby Christina's diary, Whitney now told her to be true to yourself, instead of constantly saying be perfect. The time Whitney and Bobby Christina spent together during that period was now of higher quality. When Whitney was teaching her daughter music, she would say, "Learn the feeling, not the technique." This change would also have positive effects on Bobby Christina's own musical development. Media's gradual acceptance. The media, which initially saw the Manchester concert as a failure, gradually developed a different perspective. Especially music critics began to evaluate Whitney's performance that night as raw authenticity. Rolling Stone magazine published a special article on the first anniversary of the Manchester concert and described the concert as one of the most courageous performances in music history. The article ended with these words: "Whitney Houston technically failed that night, but reached the peak humanly." Whitney's philosophical transformation. The Manchester concert also led to fundamental changes in Whitney's life philosophy. Whitney now defined success differently. Previously, success meant perfect performance for her, but now success meant being authentic. Whitney said this in one of the rare interviews she gave during that period. "I learned in Manchester that people love me, not because I'm Whitney Houston, but because I'm Whitney. That's a big difference." This philosophical change also manifested itself in Whitney's daily life. She now preferred comfortable clothes instead of expensive outfits, and stayed in more modest places instead of luxury hotels. Whitney had simplified her life. The lasting legacy. When Whitney Houston passed away in 2012, the Manchester concert became an important part of her legacy. The courage Whitney showed that night became a source of inspiration for future generations of artists. Today there's a special plaque for Whitney Houston at Manchester AO Arena. The plaque reads, "Whitney Houston taught us here the power of being real." This plaque is visited by thousands of people every day. What happened at Manchester AO Arena that night was one of music history's most painful but also most human performances. Whitney Houston lost her voice that night, but found her heart, and perhaps that was her greatest gift to her audience.